Hello everyone, good evening. So welcome to the third session of the Critical Agrarian Studies seminar series, and welcome everyone who has joined through the Zoom as well. I hope they can hear me. The Zoom crowd, okay. So before we start the session today, I would like to remind briefly what are the objectives of this Critical Agrarian Studies seminar series. So, which is we are supposed to be critical of the dominant paradigm in agrarian studies, mainly present in international institutions, university agriculture departments, and think tanks, which is the need to subsume everything to the free market, and transform labor, natural resources, and means of production into commodities based on taken for granted assumptions of private property rights, money, and competition. So, as SSC or as the Critical Agrarian Studies seminar series, we actually broadly define agriculture. It is not just the paddy farming or paddy farming, but also we include like fisheries, plantation, agriculture, animal husbandry, and etc. So what we try to do, we try to privilege the oppressed or the socially marginalized peasants or agrarian workers and their voices, to bring their voices, and especially not just to understand their predicaments, but also how we can transform or change those conditions what they are living. So with this idea in our mind, so our inaugural seminar was conducted by Dr. Urs Geiser, Associate Senior Lecturer at Zurich University, Department of Geography. He presented some thoughts on the subject and touched upon three main aspects. A critique of the notion of peasant, proliferation of state and non-state actors in the agrarian sector, and also the need of careful rethinking to strategically approach the grassroots. So basically, Urs laid down the sort of platform in his inaugural session. And then we had a session with Dr. Kalparaj Raksha, who is a senior lecturer at the Department of Economics, University of Devaka, on the topic of the agrarian question, debt, theory, tendencies, and praxis. So basically, he concluded that this agrarian question is not something outdated, but it's very much alive, and we need to think how we can revive the discourse or discussion around the critical agrarian sector, which basically SSA initiated in 1980s. So today we will have our third session with Dr. Devaka Gunawardena, Comrade Devaka. So it's good to see you after many years. Welcome Devaka to the SSA, and we are pleased to have you here today. So let me briefly introduce who Devaka is. Devaka is a political economist and independent researcher with a PhD from the University of California, Los Angeles, which is titled Determining the Value of Labor Power, Workers in Sri Lanka's Export Garment Industry. He has been involved in activist initiatives to promote critical debate about Sri Lanka's political economy. And Devaka is a regular columnist for SSA's on Polity, and also Daily FT, The Wire, and Economic and Political Weekly, among other platforms. So in the context of the current economic crisis, the agrarian question, especially the need to revive the food production or the food security in the countries, has become more urgent than ever to avert even more devastating outcomes. So today, Devaka will provide a brief overview of classical engagement with the agrarian question mainly through European Marxism, and he will propose a critical return to the classical debate by re-examining the views of specifically Rosa Luxemburg, who in her magnum opus, The Accumulation of Capital, framed the rural dispossession in terms of capitalist imperialism. So engaging with Luxemburg's work, Devaka will sketch an emerging project to identify the possible social forms in Sri Lanka and elsewhere. So not just which is important for Sri Lanka, but also the similar countries all over the world, and that can resist such dispossession. So Devaka will give his talk for 40 to 45 minutes, and then we will have a Q&A session, and also remind for the Zoom people who are joining on Zoom, they also can raise their questions in the Zoom chat, so which will take after the Devaka's talk. So without further ado, Devaka, I would like to invite you to give your talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Comrade Upul and the entire SSA staff. Really appreciate it. I know that this is a lot of work to assemble these types of talks, and so I really appreciate it. So, I think that Upul provided a great introduction, especially like this whole issue of the agrarian question. And essentially what that means is just, what does it mean for the persistence of agriculture, right? Even under conditions of, what we would call modern capitalism, right? Industrial society, right? We've assumed that, factories will sort of take over the entire landscape. But what does it mean, the fact that, there are still people cultivating, right? There are still people producing our food. This is a big question, obviously. So in my talk today, I'm just going to outline some key aspects of this question, how it's been taken up and debated within the Marxist tradition, especially, and what it means for revisiting it during the current crisis in Sri Lanka. And so, just to kind of summarize very briefly my main argument, I propose that the Marxist revolutionary and theorist Rosa Luxemburg came up I propose that Rosa Luxemburg came up with a very relevant framework for analyzing the agrarian question in her major work, The Accumulation of Capital. Usually this book, people take it up within Marxist debates about imperialism, but I argue that it actually has a lot of implications for the agrarian question as well. So for those who aren't familiar, Rosa Luxemburg was an important thinker in Germany and Poland at the turn of the 20th century. She engaged in many debates within the main German Marxist party at her time, the Social Democratic Party. And before eventually she split, actually, because of their support for Germany's participation in World War I. And this was obviously contra the idea that, the proletariat should not be involved in the struggles between nations, right? And so they were, she along with Karl Liebknecht, another German Marxist, they split and they formed the Communist Party of Germany. And they participated actually in a very dramatic uprising from 1918 to 19, which ended in a failed revolution and her own death at the hands of proto-fascist German paramilitaries. So she had obviously a very dramatic life, and even in this ferment, she was still producing major theoretical work. So Luxemburg's debates within her own party often focused on issues such as the need to combat bureaucracy within the Social Democratic Party, along with rethinking, Marxism, what it means for resisting imperialism. And at the time, Germany, of course, was one of the major European powers involved in colonizing the rest of the world, though not on the same scale as, say, Britain or France. Nevertheless, Luxemburg was a perceptive observer of this tendency. She put forward the argument that capitalism could only survive through the dispossession of non-capitalist societies, especially in what has now become known as the global periphery. She drew from Marx's own argument that capitalism requires primitive accumulation to be established. What that meant in practice was slavery, land grabbing, and other forms of extra economic coercion. That means outside of the market, right? You have, these illegal and often violent methods, right? And so Luxemburg's argument was an extension of Marx because she said that primitive accumulation was not just part of capitalism's origins, it was an ongoing tendency. This is very, very key. Usually when we think about the nature of the capitalist system, people argue that it's about the workers who are exploited, and of course that is a very critical part of that, right? But Luxemburg's innovation was also to say that capitalism also needed an outside, It needed these other societies that it could tear apart in order to then sell its goods and to force its entry into these other places. So why is this process so important for understanding the agrarian question? Well, according to Luxemburg, capitalism's dispossession of non-capitalist societies meant destroying the basis of the natural economy. And you see that's in quotes, right? Because the idea is that there was actually essentially other types of industries, manufacture really, that was embedded within these agrarian livelihoods. And so, to use a very relevant example from South Asia, during the British colonial period, Britain prohibited Indian textiles from being produced in rural communities so that they could flood the market with their own cheap goods. And this, of course, inspired Gandhi's protests, right? Swadeshi, or local manufacture, right? So Luxemburg, she did remain rooted in sort of the formative assumptions of industrialization that shaped Europe's development. I mean, she did believe that, ultimately industrial capitalism was going to subsume everything else because it was by nature more efficient, right, in terms of its techniques. But at the same time, she was also very critical and recognized that you can't just assume rural areas are essentially about agriculture, that there were these other industries, right, these other tendencies of manufacturing that were wiped out through dispossession. So this is going to be very key later on in the argument as we discuss the implications. So the critical thing here is that for Marx, at least, buying and selling under capitalism are separated in space and time. So that what that means is that you can produce something, but until its value is realized, and this is a very important idea, the circuit can't be completed, the cycle can't be completed. So in addition to production, you also need to have consumption, right? And so Luxemburg took this analysis further by pointing out that capitalism as a closed circuit was unable to realize the value it created because there wasn't enough capacity to consume the goods that were produced through the exploitation of workers. Capital reinvests its profits into expanded reproduction, while workers' wages by definition exclude their creation of surplus value. What that means is that a paid wage doesn't cover the total value of what the worker produces. This excess is what Marx called surplus value. As a result, Luxemburg realized that capitalism needed to dispossess communities, destroying, for example, these traditional industries that I mentioned, so that it could force people to purchase the products created within the capitalist system. This, again, involved extra economic coercion. And so, as Luxemburg put it, quote, in reality, however, the process of separating agriculture and industry is determined by factors such as oppressive taxation, war, or squandering and monopolization of the nation's land, and thus belongs to the spheres of political power and criminal law, no less than with economics, right? So we're not just dealing with, an abstract market here, right? This is about dispossession, okay? So this emphasis on a political dimension is crucial, I think, for keeping in check what we often call the teleological impulse within mainstream Marxism. And what that means is this idea that some people ascribe to Marx, but it's also debated, that bourgeois industrial society is inevitable, right? And it does have these productive innovations, which then eventually the workers will take over, right, through socialism, right? But the reality is that insofar as imperial violence is applied to the global periphery, this does not, in fact, create the material basis on which a domestic class of industrial capitalists can further accumulate wealth, right? And this was the debate even that happened many decades ago within Sri Lanka's own Marxist parties about the nature of the comprador bourgeoisie, right? The idea that the bourgeoisie was not oriented towards accumulation in Sri Lanka. So, the clearest example today, of course, is extraction from global finance capital. And what that means is that Sri Lanka has taken out loans and is now forced, for example, to sell public assets to meet the strict requirements of an IMF bailout agreement designed with the interests of rich bondholders in mind. Because of the premature deindustrialization that is occurring, this process requires a very different understanding of the resistance, which involves groups that do not necessarily fall under the urban working class. And one of the terms that my frequent collaborator and I, we use is the working people, right? Because it connotes this idea that across the world and the urban divide, right, there are people who are struggling with their own reproduction of their daily livelihoods, right? And so even if they're not necessarily working in a factory, right, they do also have certain political investments, interests, and possibly even resistance to this system. So, I guess, now that I've gotten this basic summary out of the way, hopefully it's helpful as, just to keep in the back of our minds as I attempt a very rapid and perhaps I should say foolhardy survey, and I'm looking at Skanda because he's, I know he has it, he has the library of references, and I know I'm going to mess up somewhere, but I'm gonna try it. So, yeah, very rapid survey of Marxist engagement with the agrarian question. Okay? So, we'll then return with fresh eyes to Luxemburg's work to understand where and how it might be extended to encompass new possibilities for theorizing the social forms. And here I use the word social form, and I'll return to it later. But like, for example, cooperatives, right? Other institutions, organizations capable of resisting such dispossession. If I'm going to go to the next slide. Okay. Thank you. So, the first question is, why start with Marx when discussing the agrarian question? So, Marx, of course, was embedded in a very long tradition of political economy, right, including the French and British sort of schools of thought. And, there was a group of people known as the French physiocrats, and I have their name up there, who thought that surplus value was essentially the net product generated from the land, right? And that could be not just cultivation, it could also be extraction from mines, right? But this idea, though, that land was essential to the creation of surplus value was very much embedded in an agrarian understanding. And so Marx took his own unique approach to the question of value by framing it in terms of the logic of accumulation within capitalism. So what that meant was that for Marx, surplus value was actually created through the exploitation of workers in the factories that produced this surplus value, and then it was sort of divvied up, right, among different categories, whether profit, interest, or rent. And so the specific manifestation of those different categories still derived from capital, right, still derived from capital's exploitation of workers, right? So Marx did then bring into view this sort of agrarian question, but from a different angle, right? He addressed this whole problem of rent, for example, but still it was, subsumed within this growing industrial system. So Rosa Luxemburg actually pointed out Marx's own theoretical innovation and his divergence from the bourgeois economists, insofar as he no longer saw the question of political economy in terms of a natural divide between town and country. This was no longer, he didn't consider this natural. Instead, it is the effect of a reciprocal relationship between two economic departments, and I put them here, Department 1 and Department 2. Or, again, as Luxemburg put it, we have seen that the tradition of distinguishing between agriculture and industry as the foundation of reproduction was kept up in economic theory until Marx introduced his epoch-making distinction of the two productive departments in society for producer and consumer goods, okay? So this point is actually key, because when we discuss social problems such as hyperurbanization, we need to constantly bring it back to the logic of capitalism. Through his political economic method, he was able to see this as a reflection of different class struggles, right? And so he contextualized this dynamic from a historical perspective, and he shifted from, feudal lords and serfs to contemporary capitalists and workers. But he didn't just ascribe it to the, say the natural value of the land or natural assumptions of, whatever surplus was being created. He saw it as being embedded within the logic of capitalism. But at the same time, Marx was also embedded in his own 19th century European intellectual context, and that valued and celebrated the progress of bourgeois industrial society. And there's been many debates here, and I don't intend to get into all of them, about whether or not Marx saw this progress, as inevitable, as effective, necessary, whatever you want to call it. And of course, some people have even argued that in Marx's later writings, he has a more non-linear understanding of the kind of change that could potentially lead to the overthrow of capitalism. But what's relevant for us today is that, again, Marx himself, he raised certain issues, but he did not necessarily write about the agrarian question specifically. Okay, that was, he had passing remarks. In fact, people often cite, his remarks in his analysis of the regime of Louis Bonaparte during the 19th century, where he described French peasants as a sack of potatoes, right? And this was, again, part of the sort of the historical political writing that Marx was doing, but it wasn't necessarily his own entire analysis of the agrarian question. So that had to be taken up by other people. And so that's where we have to get to Karl Kautsky. Okay, Karl Kautsky, like Luxemburg, was a member of the German Social Democratic Party. Now, Luxemburg split, as I mentioned, during World War I, but Kautsky was like one of the originators, basically, of this party. And he had very close contact with Marx's collaborator, Friedrich Engels. And so Engels passed along a lot of the information on Marx's work, and Kautsky tried to synthesize his own perspective. And so he actually produced a book called The Agrarian Question, where he analyzed this in the German context. And so, again, he agreed with Marx, for example, that the peasantry was destined to undergo class differentiation as capitalism penetrated the countryside. So what that meant was, as market relations took over, some people did better than others, right? And therefore they were able to concentrate more land, gain more effective tools, and so on and so forth, where you'd see, again, the idea being it's relatively linear, right? Eventually larger and larger farms will sort of take over, right? But Kautsky actually disagreed with this, and he recognized that the peasant family farm, for example, may persist and continue to operate within this formation without necessarily dissolving. So again, we're already seeing some sort of critical pushback, right? Some sort of contextualization, right, of this idea that, industrial progress is inevitable, right? And these debates were linked to Kautsky's own opposition to reformists within his party. So Kautsky, again, initially at least endorsed the goal of revolution, but there were other people, such as Edward Bernstein and Georg von Voldemar, who opposed them, because they said, reforms could be achieved within capitalism, right? That would eventually overturn it. But they at least did take seriously also this question of a program for the peasantry. And so they actually said, we need a program for the German peasants, for example, in southern Germany, to have effective relief from taxes, right? Or to be able to, get the products to market. Whatever the tariff barriers were required, they actually wanted to produce a program for the peasantry. They didn't want to just say, okay, eventually they'll disappear and the industrial proletariat will take over. And so even though Kautsky had his own analysis, he actually was sort of dismissive of this, right? Because again, he still saw it as linked to the reformist overall goal that they were trying to stabilize capitalism. The consequences, though, of the economic crisis in Germany meant that the infamous Junker landowners in the eastern part of the country eventually led the increasingly immiserated smallholders into the rest of the country into an alliance with Nazism. Okay, so this goes over, again, a lot of the history, but there was, people often talk about the failure of the German Social Democratic Party in terms of imperialism, in terms of Germany's position in World War I, but there is also this basic question of what do you offer people in these rural areas, because they were an electoral party. They were gaining more votes, but they've struggled to come up with an adequate solution, right, for the peasantry. So, meanwhile, the locus classicus, meaning the classic location of Marxist engagement, not only shifted from France and Germany, it had gone all the way to Russia. You know, in the mid-19th century, there was a lot of debate about these questions in Russia as well. And in fact, I didn't have a chance to put it on the slide here, but there was a great book that I came across recently that I highly recommend, called Roots of Revolution by Franco Venturi, who was an Italian anti-fascist partisan, but also a phenomenal historian. I mean, I honestly don't know how people in those days did it, right? I mean, they were involved actively in these struggles, but they were also producing monumental works of just critical theory and archival research. And so Roots of Revolution actually argued that the Narodnik tradition was quite complex. And so the Narodniks, as I put here, were the populists. Okay, Narod in Russian means people. Okay, so these were the original populists. You know, now when we talk about populists, we just think, oh yes, okay, let's play the electoral game. But populism in the 19th century was very closely linked to an agrarian vision. I want to stress this, okay? I really want to stress this. So these meanings of these terms change. So let's not just assume, okay, populist, therefore, you know, these are the same as the people, you know, now organizing anti-austerity parties in Europe, right? There's a difference. And so, you know, the Russians were debating, and of course there was a classic originator of Russian Marxism, Plekhanov, who argued with these Narodniks. But again, like Venturi says, these populists actually had a very complex understanding of Russian history. And they introduced this idea of Obshchina. Okay, Obshchina was the Russian peasant commune. Okay? And the idea was that maybe, just maybe, this could provide an alternative to bypassing this whole process of primitive accumulation, for example, that had occurred in Britain, you know, during the enclosure movement. And in fact, the Obshchina, through its governing council, the Mir, could offer an alternative that did not force the peasantry into the misery that had befallen, right, the British, you know, peasants who were forced off the land, right, who became workers cramped into these hovels, right, these factories, you know, Manchester, Liverpool, right, you imagine, you know, thick clouds of smoke, right. The Russian Narodniks were looking at this, and even as they opposed the Tsar, right, during the time, the Tsar was obviously in power, they were also thinking, okay, can we think of another form, a social form, like the Obshchina, to resist this? And so there's actually a very famous quote by, you know, the man who wrote the book, the first one, What is to be Done, Chernyshevsky, who then Lenin later took this title and used it for his own pamphlet, and now people read Lenin and assume, he just came up with all these ideas on his own, maybe he's brilliant. And no doubt he was brilliant, but he was also engaged in an active debate within his own Russian context. And Chernyshevsky, who in the 19th century wrote What is to be Done, said, history is like a grandmother, because she is very sweet with her grandchildren. Ruthless with her own children, but very sweet with her grandchildren, because she provides them the marrow so that they can thrive and survive, even while she was, you know, strict and tougher on her own children. And so again, this idea, and of course it's a gender metaphor, but it's still very interesting, is this idea that, you know, through this sort of latecomer advantage, you could bypass, right, all the different paths that had occurred elsewhere, especially in Britain, which had required the dispossession of the peasantry, and instead you could go through, for example, the peasant commune to establish, you know, a form of socialism, right? So this was a huge debate. So, you know, I just wanted to point that out here. So, of course, after a long, long debate throughout the 19th century, where many people sacrificed their lives, right? I mean, these were people who really believed, right, in this agrarian vision. You know, eventually, it was understood very clearly that Russia was still embedded in this capitalist system. And of course, you do have people like Lenin who ask, okay, what are the effective tactics now we do need in order to organize the proletariat, right? And this then initiated the whole debate about the political alliance between the workers and the peasantry, okay? But, of course, after winning power, you still have to deal with the problems. And so, even though the Bolshevik revolution was successful, as many of you I'm sure know, they were immediately invaded, right, by other countries, basically by the other imperialist powers. These were called the white armies, right? White in contrast to red. And so you imagine this entire country is under siege. They're also trying to deal with, the massive destruction of their own industries and countryside. And so they have to take a lot of, honestly, very harsh decisions, which now we, of course, debate. And we ask, okay, does this mean, is this an effective model for, honestly, like a transition to communism? But first they initiated war communism, right, which was just very disciplinary, very regimental. But then there was a brief period of liberalization under the new economic policy, right, the early 1920s. And so this is where Lenin actually debated a man named Chayanov, Alexander Chayanov. And I think it's on the next slide, yes. So Chayanov actually, Lenin was, again, taking up where Kautsky left off and arguing that the differentiation of the peasantry was inevitable, right? They were going to disappear. Agricultural laborers were going to become more predominant. These large landed estates were going to grow. And so eventually you had the possibility where you could nationalize these estates, right? But at the same time, there was this persistence of the family farm, right? The persistence of these rural smallholders. And so it was ambiguous, but Alexander Chayanov said, okay, the peasant family farm actually works on a different economic logic than even the big farm, because it relies on, it's a conflation of both the household and the productive unit, right? Those two things are combined, and so you have people who are able to basically sell below the value of their labor, or whatever it is, engage in this sort of drudgery, as he called it, but that allowed them to survive an economic downturn better than, say, a capitalist farm, right, which requires, a certain level of profit, certain margins, right, that need to be maintained. That would destroy, a typical, right, free market enterprise. But for these peasant family farms, they were able to actually produce below certain minimums, right, and certain thresholds, while still maintaining this alternative, right, this calculus of cost and benefit. And so he talked about this, this entire calculus, and it's turned into a long debate. Even in India, for example, they're still debating it, about whether this applies, for example, to the Indian smallholder. But Chayanov, I want to be clear, we shouldn't just think of Chayanov in terms of sort of the technical question of peasant economics, but also his political vision. And this is actually something that Theodore Shanin, and I forgot to mention Theodore Shanin, a critical scholar of agrarian studies during the 1970s, he and Hamza Alavi also have a fantastic introduction in Kautsky's Agrarian Question, which you should also take a look at if you're interested. But Theodore Shanin also emphasized this in his republication of Chayanov's works, which were discovered after his death. Because, as you know from history, Lenin died, and Lenin actually, even though he debated Chayanov, there was still a sort of moment of, if you want to call it freedom to think, right, within the Bolshevik Revolution that was completely squashed under Stalin. After Stalin, that was it, right? And so Stalin killed Chayanov, right, as he killed many other people. So, Trotsky and everyone else. So, but Chayanov, again, proposed a federation of cooperatives that would allow these peasant farms to take advantage of scale, right? To take advantage of the benefits of, whatever you want to call it, large-scale production, but through cooperatives, right? I want to say that he called it vertical integration, but he had a different name for it, right? But essentially, it wasn't just forced collectivization, which is what Stalin eventually did, right? Which is where you move people, all of them off the farms and onto a big, state-owned farm. He saw the possibilities of uniting these different smallholders to overcome their isolation through this federation, right, of peasant cooperatives. So this, again, it's an idea worth, I think, thinking about as we start to try and recover lost possibilities, right? As we start to think, right? Just like the populists and the Obshchina, how can we continue to think about these, right? As not just live, but potentially recoverable, okay? So, there's a gap, obviously, between, the Great Purge, right? Forced collectivization, Stalin, all of that, and then the 1960s and 70s. And this is where you get into national liberation struggles. These were struggles in the periphery. So now we're shifting from Europe to the global periphery, right? And so we're talking about Algeria, we're talking about Cuba, we're talking about other countries that didn't necessarily fall under this European rubric. And so actually, a lot of the Western left, they wanted to look at China as a possible example. And so they said, okay, does Mao's China offer an alternative, right, to rural mobilization? Because as you know, Maoism very much has a conception of the peasantry, right, and its supposed role within this political alliance, but also even in the process of governing, right, what should be done. And so, this is a very hairy debate, and you have scholars like Giovanni Arrighi, for example, in one of his last works, who argued that potentially, right, this East Asian, what he called market economy, but in his definition included these state-led elements, right, that weren't just pure capitalist free market. It was a different understanding of a market economy. But Giovanni Arrighi, said, okay, look at China's town and village enterprises, for example, these TVEs. And this goes back to the question that Luxemburg posed. Do you have to dispossess the countryside? Do you have to destroy its industry so that people are forced to migrate and work in these big factories? Or can you avoid that through a less lopsided emphasis on urbanization? And so Arrighi actually called this accumulation without dispossession. He said, is accumulation without dispossession possible? Because one of the ideas, if we remember Luxemburg, who was talking about primitive accumulation, she used this term, but the modern term that's been used by people like David Harvey is that this is accumulation by dispossession, right? So again, Arrighi was asking as a counterfactual, is accumulation without dispossession possible? I don't intend to get into this whole debate, to be honest with you, because China has its own class contradictions and issues. But what I do propose is that we adopt a more pluralistic, and I want to emphasize this, a pluralistic approach to national liberation struggles. So meaning we're not just going to try and derive a model from China, from Russia, from anywhere. We're going to look at all these different countries, right, involved in these national liberation struggles and see, again, what different things they may offer. And so, again, it's an idea basically that there doesn't have to necessarily be a transition from feudalism to capitalism, which in the very linear readings of Marx, that's what happens, it goes like that. Instead, it can be more of a seesaw, like again, back and forth, between capital and those forces, such as peasants, capable of pushing back. So again, Luxemburg talked about the dispossessive tendency, right? But now we have to go into the basis for resistance, because she just, assumed honestly that, eventually this dispossession is going to morph into inter-imperialist warfare. So in that sense, she did anticipate that this is not sustainable. It's going to turn into inter-imperialist warfare. And that did actually happen, right? World War I, World War II, that those battles occurred, but yet capitalism obviously wasn't just overcome. And so we do have to think, okay, if this is almost like a permanent tendency, what is the basis for resisting this dispossession that doesn't necessarily assume that there can be an ultimate, say, proletarian victory, although that could eventually happen. But what do we do in the meantime, right? What are the forces of resistance capable of organizing in the meantime? And so, again, Eric Wolf, who was an anthropologist, he talked about the national liberation struggles, and he argued that the systemic threat that the market posed to the middle peasantry, again, we talked about the class formations within the rural countryside. Again, it's not just all the homogenous peasantry, right? You have the poorer peasantry, you have the agricultural laborers, you have the richer peasantry. But he was saying actually it was the middle peasantry that was pushed into resistance because they were threatened by this penetration of market relations into the countryside. And he suggested that this was the reason for all these rebellions against imperialism that occurred in very diverse countries, from Mexico to Cuba to Algeria to China to Vietnam to Russia. So he looked at multiple case studies in his famous work, Peasant Wars of the 20th Century, and again, that was the most visible form of peasant resistance. And again, during the 1960s and 70s, we still thought this was possible, right? People did actually take inspiration, right, from the defeat of US imperialism in Vietnam But then what happened? Well, as we know, neoliberalism, right? I mean, to put it in one word, which, obviously there's always going to be a question, okay, does this capture every single dynamic or tendency? But overall, we can argue, historically, there was a counter-revolution of capital against labor, especially in the northern countries, but even in the southern countries through the IMF's structural adjustment policies. And so it became unclear, okay, again, what is going to be the resistance? But there is a newer generation of scholars, such as, Harriet Friedman, Barbara Harris White, and Jan van der Ploeg, who argue that actually we have to look not just at the explicit resistance, such as rebellion, but also the subtle yet pervasive expressions of a desire for autonomy from the market, okay? So again, we're going to get into this when we talk now about the current context in Sri Lanka, whether there is a basis for this type of re-peasantization. Okay, this is a very key term, re-peasantization. So I know I'm, coming up on time here, but thankfully I think I got through the main slides. Okay, so here we have the slide, on the crisis now in Sri Lanka. Okay, what is the alternative? Okay, we've talked about these different social forms, so now what is the alternative here? And so, again, I think if we were thinking in terms of the vulgar interpretation of Marx, we would just assume a program for the peasantry is unnecessary because technical change and modernization would eventually lead to the consolidation of land into more efficient farms, right? But can we assume this, right? And now we see an instance where in Sri Lanka now people are desperate for survival, right? They're looking for alternative structures of food production, right? And so this is where the new agrarian scholars have focused on a distinction between food regimes and food sovereignty. Okay, so the idea is that food regimes disassemble all these components of how food is produced into agrochemical inputs, right? Into processing, right? The creation of a mass market for consumer items, for example, in the US, right? Which involves many different supply chains around the world, right? But food sovereignty is this idea, again, of people like Philip McMichael and Raj Patel put it, of reaching for other modes of sovereignty in which people can reclaim control of their lives, okay? So, again, I think even before this crisis, honestly, when I was doing my own research in the free trade zones, especially in Kadunayaka and Kokkola, I would come across people and they would actually identify always as Abigamme Minisu. We are villagers. We are villagers. If I said, Ogalang Kamkaruo, are you guys workers? Kamkaruo. That's a very technical term in Sinhala. They'd be like, what the heck are you talking about? Abigamme Minisu. And there was a class identification there too, but it wasn't just reducible to, okay, you're the working class, right? So even before the crisis, right, people maintained their links, right, with the villages. And again, there was a gender dimension to this as well, like cost of living, childcare, right, the lack of adequate resources, right, even surrounding the free trade zones for many of the workers who had migrated from the villages. So again, we can't just assume, okay, capitalism is going to swamp everything, right, and people are just going to work at factories and the agrarian question is dead, sort of thing, right? So, to move on finally to this alternative, again, we can argue these distinctions. And I propose now, in our discussion and in future debates, that we start breaking this question up into more manageable distinctions, okay? So, for example, Prabhat Patnaik has also, acknowledged that there's a difference between land nationalization and land redistribution, okay? So land nationalization would be, for example, a progressive government, whatever, taking over land. But what do you do in the case of Sri Lanka, for example, where up to, theoretically, 80% of the land is owned by the state, right? So how do you redistribute that? And that contains alternative questions about the nature of peasant autonomy vis-a-vis the state. This is something that in Sri Lanka I feel like we haven't sufficiently taken up within the critical debates about what is the nature of peasant autonomy, right? You just assume, okay, the state will provide, the state will do this, the state will do that. Even the critical scholars, right? We have to push this a little further, right? Especially now when we're thinking about these alternatives. So I want to keep that distinction in mind. Another thing is that you will now see certain figures within the establishment even promoting things such as abolishing the Paddy Lands Act, right, of 1958. Okay, I mean, this is really about land liberalization, right? Again, the vulgar, honestly, you can call it a vulgar if you want to. It's a vulgar economic thesis, Marxist or bourgeois, that assumes land will just be concentrated into more and more efficient farms. But I would argue that things like the Paddy Lands Act, even if they had their inefficiencies, their challenges, whatever, their blind spots, in theory at least, they were opposed to just the pure principle of market concentration. So what does it mean to now try and concentrate through the market when the market itself is breaking down because of the crisis in Sri Lanka? Okay, we have seen this breakdown, right, in the hoarding of goods, right, in the skyrocketing cost of goods. And now you're saying, okay, let's further liberalize, right, these land agrarian relations, right? So again, is there an alternative here, right? Is there an alternative basis for resisting this dispossession? Okay? So, just to come back finally to this whole question, again, I think, this whole debate about whether Sri Lanka's slowly re-emerging cooperative system is a collective social form, for example, through which, working people, peasants, whatever you want to call, are able to resist this dispossession. It's a big question, and again, many different analytical layers here. Like we could even talk about, Sri Lanka's own local history of regional and local management of rural infrastructure, such as irrigation. And I want to clarify here that this depends on breaking, for example, with a singular Buddhist nationalist imaginary, right, where they just want to recuperate civilizational state, right? We had such a great thing in the past. This is not a romantic sort of nationalist argument. This is a critical argument grounded in Sri Lanka's historical class relations, right? I want to emphasize that. But again, at the same time, can we also talk even today about how you would incorporate new productive techniques into the social relations of production, right? Because again, we can't just assume that more technical or effective methods will automatically work. To give you the best example, look at the dependency that was created on chemical fertilizers. And this was, honestly, Gota's decision was disastrous, obviously, to try and ban chemical fertilizers overnight, but this was a long legacy of the Green Revolution of the 1960s, which critical agrarian scholars now recognize was embedded in a whole other set of issues about the agro-industrial complex, right? And now you have countries like Sri Lanka that have these high-yield varieties that don't work without these chemical fertilizers, which you need to import. So again, this raises more and more questions about, okay, what does it mean to try and break with the dependency of the market? But again, I wouldn't just chalk this up or assume like, okay, well, for example, I, Devaka, am arguing that we need to go back to agriculture as some sort of primitive utopian past. Again, if we're talking about how you embed these productive techniques, maybe get the input of the people that you're working with on the ground and ask them what is critical, what is necessary to production, and that can form the basis for alternative industries, right? Again, to go back to this argument that Luxemburg said, the dispossession, right, that happened in the countryside, the destruction of industries in the countryside, can we actually now resist that or promote alternatives? It's a huge question, but I really want to clarify that I'm not just making a simple dichotomy between industry and agriculture, right? I am seeing this all as part of a whole process of dispossession and resistance, right? And so that raises many other questions about, okay, like, Upul had mentioned, if we think about agrarian relations, not just agriculture, fisheries, right? What does it mean if you want to produce boats, right, in the country, right, that are, valuable, necessary to the fishing community? That's going to raise a whole set of questions, right, about, for lack of a better word, industrial policy, right, and what types of industries you want to promote. But it's not the same thing as saying, let the FDI, let the foreign investment come in and determine our priorities, right? This has to be much more critical and much more grounded in the agrarian relations of people's livelihoods. So I think I have touched on most of my talk, and, again, I mean, there's so much more that we can discuss here, but really this is just a start. This is just a basis for continuing this conversation about what analytical levels, right, frameworks, distinctions do we need to develop here to think about this, right, without just assuming, again, like, Kalpa had also mentioned in his talk that the agrarian question is dead, right? What do we need to do to revive this question in a critical way? So I guess with that, I'm just going to look at my last page here and say, again, in Luxemburg's case, she may have assumed, or, again, a brilliant analysis of capitalist imperialism, but what does it mean now to resist that without assuming that, some global revolution is on the horizon, the immediate horizon? Again, could happen at some point, right? That conjuncture could materialize, and honestly, we're seeing many changes occurring in the world every day, but what do you do in the meantime, right? And can you think through these questions, such as cooperatives, without just assuming that they will be appropriated by the state? Can this be the basis for future and ongoing resistance? So that is where I'll leave my talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Devaka. It's very insightful and lots of things to ponder, the points that you raised. So thank you so much. I think now we can open the questions or comments or thoughts about what Devaka brought in. So even for the Zoom community, so if you have any questions, comments, please feel free to raise it, and we are happy to respond to it. I think, for me, like, there are several important points that you raised, Devaka. One thing is, like, the idea of this peasant autonomy. So it is something, I guess, in the last decades in Sri Lanka, it was something subjected to debate, even, like, because in a way, as you mentioned, like, 80%, almost 80% lands under state control, like rights, state rights. So what especially under these neoliberal reforms, like the government, they came up with some proposal to give the farmers the right to their land, then they can make decisions on their land, like whether to sell it or how to utilize it. So this decision, something like sparked debate within even the left also, like because in a way it's a good thing, like you will get the right to your land you are living, so then you can decide what to do with the land. But then some critics they point out that this is something part of the these neoliberal policies that encourage the selling of these lands, because in a way farmers get rights to their land, but on another way the big multinational corporations they can buy those lands and for their accumulation of the capital. So how do you see that issue? What's your thought on that?
So I guess So I'll respond because that's a very, very useful, interesting question. I haven't read much of his work, but of course, my friend Alan has mentioned Fernando de Soto. Of course, one of his main arguments, this development economist, he says the way you solve a lot of these issues is by giving people property rights, right? So you give them the right to their land, and then they can decide what they want to do with it, right? I think it's a very, it's a complex question, but it also involves realizing that the market is not a level playing field. Okay, this is the thing. It's not a level playing field. There is market concentration. There's concentration at different aspects of the cycle, right? From cultivation to processing to distribution. So if you just say, okay, people can sell their land, well, what's to say that during an economic crisis like this, people won't just mortgage that asset because they need to survive, right? So why can't we think of alternative forms of support? Again, you can think of state-backed credit without saying the state will take over the cooperatives, right? Or the state will take over the farms. Again, there can be other distinctions made where, you prioritize the sort of egalitarian, the leveling, the redistribution, without assuming that the market will work itself out. The largest farms are the most effective, and therefore, whoever can't stay in agriculture will eventually get out. Because again, people now need it especially to survive, right? So, I think that is it's a big question, and one that I would like to think more with people about. But that's my initial reaction, at least, right? Is this idea that we're not just talking about, equivalent actors here, right? We're talking about class, right? We're talking about other dimensions, right? Which involve other concentrations of power. And so how can you think about the types of policies that are necessary to resist that? So that would be my brief sort of reaction.
Shall I? Yeah. We have. If anyone has questions.
Thank you, Devaka. Really great. I think a lot you made us realize that there are a lot to read and a lot to do. Ignorance is very heavy from our side. I was trying to understand, Devaka, now you use this need to get this clarified. You talk about this Apigami, the Gami issue. But now in this Gama, where the land may be the kind of a means of production, but that function within a particular political context and a market context. I think the politics and markets are also extremely interconnected. So in that case, how does a peasant, how do we explain, how do we understand the decision making or choice of the peasant in such a situation? Because it's not in the economic formula alone, but there is so much of the political context, and also political context also mediate the market, or the market mediate the politics as well. So just to get an understanding.
Yeah, thank you.
Hello? Yeah. Thank you. So, I guess when I talk to people, these are just my impressions, and honestly, this is why I say this needs to be a research project, right? This needs to involve collaboration with people doing empirical work on the ground. I can read theory, I can read history, but at the end of the day, these are just guideposts. These are just, signposts of where we could maybe investigate further. But I would personally like to do more research on the subject, but just in my own experience, when I talk to people, again, there's a classical assumption that the wage will cover the costs of the workers' reproduction, right? This is the idea that once the market takes over, the worker will get a wage in the factory, and then they'll be able to buy whatever they need, right? And obviously during crises, this creates the resistance, right? This creates the opposition because people's wages are insufficient, right? But in the case of the people who I met in Gunawardena, it was very clear, and it became clear very quickly, that this wage did not cover everything, right? That people relied on other relations, especially in the rural areas where they came from, in order to survive, right? And so you get into this really tricky question where, there have been many debates in the past about, okay, does this mean that because workers have some small subsistence outside of the factory, it is allowing for hyper-exploitation in the factory because the capitalists can pay far less than the prevailing wage? Or, alternatively, is this a basis for resistance? Again, because they have that subsistence plot, right, that it can be a basis for resistance, right? It's a contradiction, right? And I'm not saying that there is any one clear answer in the case of the people that I met. But in terms of those dynamics, I met folks who said, I'm going back to farm my own small plot. I also met folks who said, I'm going back, but to work as sort of like day labor in the village, right? And so that is the differentiation within the countryside, right? We can't just assume, okay, everyone who comes to the free trade zone is, this type of, rural smallholder, right? Some people were going back, but they were working as agricultural laborers, right? They didn't have land. So, I think that's a great question, and honestly one I would like to do more research on. And also, I think in some of my previous writings, and it's been very helpful, sort of the discussion in the process of writing with the editors from Polity, for example, because people have posed questions such as, can we just assume that, there is, sort of one big bad guy, right, within the village, right? Can we just assume that, okay, you're going to talk about a cartel, right, monopolizing, right, the distribution of grains, but what about the people who also benefit under that structure, right? What are the layers, again, of that structure? Is it just, okay, now chase out the rice millers mafia, right? Because they're the bad guys, right? They're the ones who are, hoarding and holding everything up. I honestly, don't know the answer to all of these questions, but they are still worth investigating, right? And we need to do more serious empirical work on those matters. But I do believe that, let's say in general, right, in the broad context of Sri Lanka's agrarian relations, okay, it's not like, for example, some people have argued in India, you have the giant landed estates, right? Whereas in Sri Lanka, generally you don't, right? Generally it is considered that there's been a parcelization of land, right? There's in fact a challenge of involution, right? Where people are dividing up their plots to, their offspring, predominantly male, obviously. And so, is there a way of challenging that process in a way that, again, levels this question of access to land, but also provides people the support that they need? And, again, I think that one of the things that I've observed is that, this whole question of cooperatives precisely is reemerging for this reason, because in addition to land ownership, which is also important, there are other facets as well, such as processing, such as distribution. So, these are, again, just signposts, but, I couldn't answer conclusively what are the, the dynamics in the village. It's honestly something that we need to study more. So, thank you.
Thank you so much. Even I also don't know the kind of answers to that kind of question that I'm raising. Of course, now you answered in a more to the Sri Lankan experience, but from the literature that you have discussed, the surveys, what does that kind of literature talks about a situation where the agrarian community, sometimes they find the rationale for not developing and not cultivating as a more profitable and more sometimes, their rational choice is not necessarily what we expect from the farmers. From farmers, you expect to develop the property and then reproduce, cultivate, and thereby maximize their gain. But when you have a political and market condition where you can really benefit by not doing exactly what you are expected to be doing. Like for example, last time Kalpa was talking about where sometimes not cultivating your land may be much more profitable than sometimes cultivating. How does that then connect that with agrarian literature?
So, again, I think briefly to try and answer that, this was one of, I believe, Marx's points that, again, rent from land is not necessarily derived from cultivation, right? You don't have to do anything with your land. You can still get a rent from it, right? And so that brings up much bigger questions, right? About, okay, well, why is it rent skewed in this way where people are profiting more alternatively from, cultivating? But, again, I'm not as familiar, to be honest, with the specifics in this context, but I would just say that, that was one of China's points, is that there's a different calculus, right, of the family farm. But that, people just assumed, okay, well, the family farm then is stuck in the past, right? They're not going to take up all these, they're not going to adopt the most productive techniques because they're just trying to engage in this sort of threshold of survival. But again, that was China's innovation to suggest that you could have cooperatives, right? Or even a federation of cooperatives that had the scale to help them acquire these technical innovations, but not market-based, right? China was not saying, let's unleash the market. He was saying, okay, this is, in his vision, it was still socialist, right? It was still a socialist vision, but it was a question of, okay, how do we help facilitate, the adoption of these productive techniques? And, I'll just tell you one thing briefly. Like in my own experience, even in the US, I think that there is a huge emphasis on extension facilities, technical education for farmers that is designed to benefit corporations, the biggest farmers. California, right? It is what Kerry McWilliams called factories in the field. These are large farms that, support research and development in these big universities because, again, it facilitates their own profitability. But then we get into these other questions of what about, equality, redistribution, all these issues. Like, if you have farm workers migrating from other places, working on these massive farms, sort of, okay, let's say you want to then introduce mechanization, okay? Well, you introduce mechanization, now people are out of jobs, right? So there's a balance here, right? And this is why Van der Ploeg, this agrarian studies scholar, introduces this idea of labor intensification, not just capital intensification, labor intensification, because one of the benefits of cultivation is that you can renew the soil, right? You don't just exhaust the soil, you can renew it as well. And so there's actually a benefit in the long term to the value of that land if you don't just rely on the most extractive methods, if you don't just destroy the soil through monoculture and basically pumping out, as much as you can through the crops. And if instead you see it as a collective process that involves carefully thinking about the sort of techniques and how they're adopted within those communities. But again, I would say always, in my mind, with an egalitarian focus. So, I think we need more research like that and less donor-funded research that just focuses on, okay, let's do, mechanization, because that's going to be the most efficient, most effective, right? We really have to think about how these techniques are being adopted, right, within these rural communities.
Yeah, so I think we have several questions and thoughts from Zoom.
Yeah.
So I will read it out for you. So one, Maheshi Premachandra, she asked, it's not a question, just a clarification. So can cooperative system facilitate accumulation without dispossession? Please draw examples from successful cooperatives from Global South or Global North. Something related to the same question, I guess Sumati Sivamohan. Sumati asks, I don't know how accumulation can happen without dispossession unless it is that sustainable level, at the sustainable level, which means little to the actual producer unless accumulation as such is expecting to redistribution. So if you could respond to these two things, like.
Yeah, these questions are great. I'm having to think on my toes here, but I'll try. A successful example, like, I rely a lot on the knowledge and information that comes out of Jaffna, in particular, about the revival of the Northern cooperative system. That gives me hope, because it does seem like there are efforts that are growing, however small. Again, I think sometimes when you look at examples, we think, okay, it has to be a big revolution, or it has to be a big, thing that we can see as a success story. But the truth is, we're constantly having to design safeguards and buffers to prevent cooperatives from being subsumed by the market, right? What is the leverage that cooperatives could have within the market? And that requires politics. That requires a program. That can't just be solved, through market-based methods. This is where, other people like Eric Olin Wright, they talk about this. Like, okay, can you just, sort of bypass capitalism through cooperatives? And, even in the case of Spain, the famous example people use of the Mondragon Corporation, I mean, from my understanding, it has also somewhat been subsumed under these broader capitalist market tendencies. So I will never say, okay, cooperatives alone, that's the solution, go. I will always say it has to be linked to a political vision. And again, we're still working that out, but I think that there are changes in the debate happening, right? Where we don't just assume, okay, you know, let's just go with private land holding, private this, private that. You know, there has been more discussion about state-backed credit. There has been resistance to microfinance. There have been alternatives that are being discussed. So, you know, how it will all pan out, I don't know. But I do see areas where that discourse is changing. And I think, again, another critical part I forgot to mention is the need for development banks, development banking specifically, right? We focused a lot on other forms of finance. We also need to think about that, right? As a way of, you know, facilitating access to credit, right? So, you know, maybe there are possibilities there with cooperative credit. But yeah, I mean, unfortunately, as you've seen, you know, a lot has also been destroyed, right? Like China, like, I mean, like these ideas, you know, they were suppressed, right? So how do we recover them? That requires a political vision. As to Sumati's question, you know, again, I mean, yes, is the accumulation without dispossession possible? I think that is like one of the biggest questions. And, you know, I was, you know, ambivalent about Arrighi's argument, you know, in the context of China, because in China you have seen things like phenomena like hyper-urbanization, right? You now see the slowdown of the property sector. Could we just assume that this is an example, right, of accumulation without dispossession because there are, you know, constituent units like the town and village enterprises? But again, I think at least in theory, what that means to me, accumulation without dispossession, is this idea that, you know, if you have a cooperative federation, right, that is obtaining credit through the state, how that's going to be distributed to the members of that cooperative, that's going to be subject to debate, right? There's going to be all kinds of questions that emerge. But I think the difference is that, you know, the reason why I would call that, at least in theory, a form of accumulation without dispossession, because it doesn't just assume that, you know, the surplus needs to be transferred out of the agrarian sector, right? That has really been the key for a lot of these discussions, this idea that in order to industrialize, again, you need to produce, you need to cultivate, and then whatever above a certain threshold needs to be, you know, extracted, right, and invested in industry. But if through cooperatives, for example, it's possible to envision alternative sorts of industries, then again, I mean, I think all of this is relative. You know, it's a question of, okay, are we facilitating or promoting a less lopsided relationship between the rural and the urban areas, right? Are we creating a situation in which people are not forced to migrate? You know, that's another thing, right? When people are dispossessed, they have to migrate, right, to the urban areas, especially usually for work or for whatever it is, economic opportunity. So I'm not saying, okay, let's keep everything static, let's maintain the village as it is, but if people aren't being forced to leave where they come from, I think that's a good sign or a good measure of, okay, this is a form of whatever you want to call it, accumulation without dispossession. But definitely I think that's a big question, and yeah, again, very useful. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. And I guess like when we talk about cooperatives, we need to keep in mind that there are like state-controlled cooperatives like MPSs or multi-purpose cooperatives. So
what's the nature of the economy?
Yeah. So there are different forms.
Yeah.
So there is a couple of questions more soon, but before that, if someone in the audience have more questions, then can go with that. Any thoughts? Come on.
Devaka, thank you so much for that fantastic tour de force, and as Pradeep said, giving us a reading list, which will keep us occupied for some time to come. I have some questions in this, but the way it's going to come out is me thinking aloud. And I'm picking up also on Sumati's question. I wondered, Devaka, whether I'm thinking of some of the work we did here and how we work around land rights, which you remember, this stuff around land grabs. Now, I understand why it feels so visceral to us, okay? Because it's something that we can see before our eyes. Land being occupied by the military, land being taken over by the archaeology department, whatever way, or land being taken over because they want to lease it to some agribusiness and so on. But if I relate that to, and of course every one of these has to be resisted, please, that goes without saying. But I wonder whether, as always, we end up taking what is still, I must say, fairly exceptional, and that becomes how we frame the movement or frame the campaign or the struggle. So this is where I want to link it back to accumulation by dispossession, by suggesting that what is actually the norm is accumulation by exploitation, right? That is what is intrinsic in Marx's analysis of capitalism. So not to say that dispossession doesn't take place, but to say that if that dispossession cannot be, there has to be a limit to the inflation of the term dispossession. So dispossession, so in other words, the extraction of surplus value from a worker or from a peasant is accumulation by exploitation. We can't make everything about dispossession, and not everything is by force. Not everything is taking place by violence. So accumulation by exploitation. I'm wondering whether, by focusing on, for example, on the land grabs, it was convenient in a way because we didn't ask ourselves, well, what do we deal with, how do we deal with the reality of the vast majority of those in rural society who are not facing land grabs, but whose situation is extremely dire. Right? There's an immiseration. That immiseration can be taking place because it's becoming increasingly unviable for them to farm their land through the compulsions of market society. It could be because of usurious finance companies and microfinance and so on, because of the absence of rural credit, affordable credit to farmers, but also, of course, reflecting the very narrow set of income sources, even in rural areas. Yes, a public sector job, but it's not going to be some big job. It's going to be some little job that the politician has found for you, or it's going to be coolie vadder, or there may be a couple of garment factories spread out somewhere. Okay, so how many things? How much is that? Out migration. Right? How much of the rural economy in Sri Lanka today is actually supported by migrant remittances rather than from the revenue coming from agriculture? So I'm very grateful to you for putting Rosa Luxemburg center stage, because I think it's important that we now start coming to this and looking at the argument through her own writing rather than coming to her through David Harvey. Number one. Second, the second is then Devaka, I worry, that you qualified it. You said, look, I'm not romanticizing, the rural life. I'm not suggesting that everybody should just remain in the village and so on. But today, if you ask somebody, do you want to stay? Somebody who is in their 20s, do you want to stay and do you want to farm? How many are going to say yes? Today, okay. Because we don't have all those other things that you were talking about, right? All that other supportive system, right, to sustain that. But I suppose what I'm saying is that we can't, that somehow we also have to speak to that frustration or that need or that desire that I need to escape from here, Because if I don't, it's not just bad for me; it's also bad for my family or my household. So, I was also interested in how over COVID we could see that agriculture in Sri Lanka was able to absorb a fair number of people. Right? We saw an actual increase in the number of people reportedly engaging in agriculture, and of course, an upturn in terms of the contribution to GDP. But I'm sure now, if we did a repeat, if we did a bit of a tracer or something, probably 90% of those who returned to farming went back. They're no longer doing it. So then we have to ask why. Why? I mean, they were doing it then as a survival strategy. But the moment they had an option of getting back to their urban service sector jobs, the shit jobs that they were doing earlier, they still took it up. Rather than being in the village and I'm a farmer. No, for them it didn't make sense. So I'm asking this as a question. It's not a question to you, Devaka. It's a question for all of us. I'm trying to understand. Without sounding like the vulgar Marxist, I'm trying to understand what is the future for family farming. I'm trying to understand that in a context in which I cannot see how to make that sustainable, how to make it viable, how to make it an income source, how to also generate the surplus. And here there is a difference, Devaka, with you, which is that I do think we need a rural surplus for our urban population, because otherwise I don't see how we can deal with our import bill. Here we are, a food-dependent country, a net food importing country, right? So, I mean, how can we deal with our balance of payments issue? We have to somehow address this. And in a situation in which our wages are so low, I mean, you can see the wage repression that is going on now. Who has had a wage increase in this country? After 2 years of COVID and 1 year of more of an economic crisis. And tax increases. I mean, unless somehow we, yes, I think we do need to have cheaper rice and cheaper eggs and cheaper everything else. And of course, I want the farmers also to get their fair income or return, not the Mudalalis. But so I'm asking this as, how do we actually sustain this? The last point I want to mention, coming back to this idea in people's heads about the family farm. Now in the plantations, there is a campaign, right, among many activists saying you have all these plantation lands which are not being utilized. Right? Remember years ago, the government said there are 57,000 hectares or something of unutilized land. But when you ask then the activists, the campaigners, usually from NGOs, not from trade unions, NGOs, well, what do you mean? Their idea is, give everybody that half an acre or 1 acre or 2 acres or 2.5 acres. In their mind, it's like again this idea of how the similar peasantry, DSN and I get the similar peasantry, give everybody those X number of acres, maybe try to give them a cow or something, and then. But my question is, so in other words, nobody is suggesting collectivization. Nobody is suggesting collective farms. Nobody is suggesting collectivization nobody's even thinking of the next stage. How do we make inputs economical? How do we deal with the issue of the distribution from the farm gate, to wherever we're marketing it to? How do we escape from the Mudalalis and others who control, right? Who own the lorries, who produce the inputs? I mean, unless we who produce start collectivizing, there's no way we can escape from this. So it's a half-baked question. My question, I suppose, is that even those who are thinking in terms of re-peasantization, in this case of the estates, or what used to be estates and what they would like to see as new villages, which of course I'm in favor of the idea, but how again it's in my mind, it's about a reversion to a certain golden age of the Sri Lankan peasantry, which was probably short-lived or which probably never even existed. And I'm wondering whether, even if you were able to do it, whether it would survive one generation. Sorry.
Okay, wow, I mean, awesome. a lot to tackle here. I think, there are going to be overlaps, actually, in my response. It's not just, oh, I disagree. But I think these are very useful, critical questions, because I appreciate your skepticism. I think that, it's right by nature to be skeptical. By temperament, I wouldn't say I'm an optimist, but it is that classic Gramscian phrase, right? Pessimism of the intelligence, optimism of the will. It's like, I'm going to think critically too, but at the end of the day, I'm going to push, right? I'm going to push for whatever I think is possible as an alternative. And as we've seen in the case of Rosa Luxemburg, who, in the most dramatic circumstances, which I, again, wouldn't compare in any way, shape, or form, but like she, pushed, even though she knew this might fail, right? Even though this might not work. Sometimes that's all you can do, right? And then there are moments, right, where something erupts, right? Something changes dramatically that you never considered. So I'll preface all that just by saying that's my ethos, that's my temperament. But of course I appreciate, this dialogue. So to go to your first question, okay, exploitation versus dispossession. I think there have been a lot of sociological arguments that have been made about, okay, use Marx for exploitation, use Polanyi for dispossession, okay, mix, combine, repeat, sort of, okay, sorry. I think that we need to look at the historical dynamics, the process, right? Why, under certain circumstances and certain periods, one takes predominance over the other, okay? Now, to give you an example, RAB, again, in Adam Smith in Beijing, he critiques Robert Brenner. Brenner was, is the famous, right, Marxist political economist, actually also at my alma mater. I was lucky to meet him. People like, that generation, I mean, brilliant minds, right? But Brenner, put forward a thesis, which I'm not completely intimately familiar with, but that, that this enclosure movement in England was an example of class struggle, right, in the countryside, in which you have to look at the internal dynamics of that development to understand how capitalism emerged, right? Rather than what Brenner called the neo-Smithian Marxism of Gunawardena, Frank, and other dependency theorists who argued that trade, exploitation, overseas, all of that was the prime mover, right? The primary driver of the development of capitalism in England, right? And so again, it's this back and forth, right? How much do you value the internal versus the external factors? But one thing that Argy said in response to Brenner that I appreciate was he said, that may have been the case in England, that enclosure, dispossession, actually provided a basis for accumulation, but in so many other cases that we have now seen in the global periphery, it is the exact opposite, right? This is why I said the comprador bourgeoisie, right, does not necessarily orient towards accumulation in Sri Lanka, right? There are active forms of dispossession that do not necessarily lead to the material basis, right, for the further development of whatever you want to call it, industrial capitalism, right? And so that's why what we are experiencing now, or what we see now, I should say, is premature deindustrialization in many countries across the world, right? So, again, I'm talking to workers in the factory, they're saying they're being exploited, but they're also like, there aren't even enough job opportunities here, right? So that can't just be categorized under exploitation. That you have to look at the whole character of Sri Lanka's external relationship with the world, which we have seen has been defined by financial extraction, sovereign bonds, right? The crisis that has occurred, right? And so I'm saying that, there is exploitation, right? Obviously there's exploitation happening within this country, any country, but when does dispossession take predominance, right? So as they say, over-determining, right, that social formation, right, or the resistance to that sort of dynamic, how does it occur, right, throughout history, right? So I'm just leaving that open as a question. We don't have to solve it now, but it is a question, right? So, to go to your second part of what you're saying, I think, if I'm understanding you correctly, it's like, what is the program for the middle class intelligentsia? What is the program for us? Me, the guy who flies on Qatar Airways, never farmed a day in my life. What is the program for me, right? Kautsky didn't have a program for the peasantry, but now it's like, okay, you're talking about agrarian rural livelihoods. Okay, so what are you going to do? Are you going to, now, is this a go to the people moment, right? Is this a neurotic, like, let's go to the people, comrade, I'll see you there, right? Okay, well, I admire the courage and the whatever you want to call it, of the folks who can do that, right? But I would say, honestly, and this is just in theory again, I think there is a lot of potential space for the type of research that we want to do, connected to those agrarian livelihoods. Doesn't mean that we all have to do the same thing, but when we're challenging a certain division of labor, intellectual as well, I do think we need to think about, okay, what is the relationship between the knowledge that we produce and what people are doing on the ground? If I'm just telling someone, okay, you can be more efficient by farming with chemical fertilizer, go. That's one thing. But if I'm actively also trying to do the research, trying to understand within these institutions that existed, including SSA, including the Hector Kobikadua Agrarian Research Training Institute, I think that's right, ARTI, whatever, let's revive those. Okay, that also is a space, right, for people who maybe live more urbanized lifestyles, but can still contribute, right, and think through these questions in relation to the practical realities, right? And again, this is why I really want to stress this. This is a food question now, too. This isn't just a land question, this is a food question. We need a public distribution system, okay? This is why it's across the rural and the urban, right? So we need to think about these, not just as, okay, you're gonna now move back to the village, but okay, like, how is someone who loses access to their income in an urban area going to survive, right? Especially during these times of crisis, right? What is the nature of the distribution of food, right? So, again, I'm just raising these as thoughts, as possibilities. But again, I think, it doesn't have to be sort of a linear return, right? It can involve many different facets. And so on the last question that you mentioned, again, I think that it's always going to be tricky. There always needs to be a political critique involved. Building those buffers, building those sort of safeguards within our concepts so that we can resist the appropriation by people such as the Sinhala Buddhist nationalists who are going to say, oh, see, okay, this is representative of the kind of, civilization that we once had. See how they're talking and celebrating? No, I want to emphasize the class dimensions. Look at monastic landlordism. Look at Leslie Gunawardena's work. Look at other people who have said, hey, even in the pre-colonial past, there were divisions. It wasn't all just homogenous, happy, go-lucky Sinhala, villages, with the temple, tank, and Baba, or whatever, that description, right? So I think we need more research on that front, too, into our own past, right? Into Sri Lanka's past, right? That is critical. But, again, like I said, I think the last thing I'll say, too, is that if you're talking about, what are people going to do? I mean, you have throughout history all these crazy, interesting, sometimes wrong-headed, but sometimes actually very valuable experiments. Now, I'll give you one from another place that I identify as home, right, the United States. During the Great Depression, they set up something called the Farm Security Administration, the FSA. And they actually gave people access to land with government support so that they could farm in communes, in basically collectives. And this was the basis for the Grapes of Wrath. You all have heard of the Grapes of Wrath. Tom Joad, right? The figure of resistance, right? And of course, the conservatives, right, the anti-New Dealers were like, and not just the anti-New Dealers, the farm business interests, right? They dismantled this. They promoted the extension services. They promoted it so that it became hyper-individualized and all about, technology and research development, and that's it, right? But there was, at least initially, a question of, oh my gosh, all these people have been thrown out of work through the Great Depression. How are they going to survive? And there was almost like a back to the land kind of movement where people were trying to think very critically, like Henry Wallace, okay, how are people going to survive? Then, when you mention do we just give them 40 acres and a horse? I mean, I'm paraphrasing. That is the demand of black people resisting oppression in the United States, right? People who were freed from slavery and basically told, do your own thing. You're not going to get anything from us, right? And so as a question of reparation, black people were the ones who were saying, give us 40 acres and a mule. Give us the ability to survive, right? So this can actually be a liberatory, an emancipatory demand, right, as part of Reconstruction. So again, I think if you're looking at the question of the estates here, the plantations, all that, again, more research, more engagement, more whatever you want to call it. But I would say, it's always going to have a political dimension. And I don't think we can just assume there's an easy technical solution. That's all I want to say. There's no easy technical solution. Because some people do think collectivization is just a question of technical efficiency. Okay, we collectivize and it'll be technically efficient. No, you have not evaded the class question of agrarian relations. So that's all I really want to emphasize. Even if that's the line you want to promote, I know that's why I said there's overlap. I know we share these assumptions. So thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Kumar, for your lighting up the discussion as you always do.
Can I just add a bit of comment?
Okay, we have a question from Zoom.
Yes. No, this is basically Kumar, responding to some of the things that you said. It's interesting what you said, so it seems like kind of particular ideology that the Sri Lankan has embraced or maybe popularized, not necessarily after 78, but even prior to that. The agriculture is a place where to survive or to exploit kind of thing. So I think whoever goes back there, either you go there to survive or otherwise to exploit. So the rationale that we expect that the agricultural sector to develop may not really sustain in the mindset of people, because our modernist story, our modernist promise is basically outside of the agriculture. From our education, even we looked at the peasant or the farmer either as a kind of opportunity to collect votes. So then a farmer being seen by the successive government as a kind of potential voter bank, right? Or otherwise a kind of a recipient of welfare policies. But successive government have not seen it in outside of that.
Right.
In the sense as a kind of a autonomous being who basically have a rationale to develop as a community. So this is not necessarily the structural condition on the ground, but this is very much of an ideological condition that the successive government has propagated, and also community continue to subscribe into this. So as a result, today by now, agrarian sector has been a kind of a field or kind of a terrain or space where either those who have no option other only to get exploited, they go back there, because that's what happened during the Corona time, right? People knew that is not the place where I want to be, but I don't have option, I go there. Or otherwise, that is the place where there are people who are connected with a certain capital and political authority, use that space to exploit. Because those either you have two groups of people, those who are ready to get exploited or those who are ready to exploit them. So I think this is a very much of a also ideological question that our research needs to look at.
Your question?
Yeah, sure, I'll just say briefly. Yeah. No, I think that's a great, standalone comment as well. But I'll just say, yes, the question of patronage, right, versus autonomous peasant action. That is also something I wanted to highlight as a tension, right? We still need to look into this, but can we assume that just because in the Mahinda Chintanaya or whatever they talk about the village or whatever, that means they were automatically committed to rural uplift, right? Rural development, alternative structure. Kumar had also mentioned, where was the actual program for self-sufficiency? I mean, you guys were importing the same amount, if not more, than any previous UNP administration. So, okay, self-sufficiency, what happened? So, yes, this is where we can't just take what the politicians say at face value either, even if they talk about, the people in the villages or what have you. Thank you.
So, I will take two questions from Zoom, which I think go hand in hand. One is from Shafia. So it's about this recent IMF thing. So with the IMF agreement in place, but also the possibility of cooperatives in Sri Lanka, how will it be possible for Sri Lankans to keep dispossession at bay? That is Shafia's question. And Aileen also asking similar question. So is there something about the current conjuncture that will push for the revival interest in the agrarian question and movements for agrarian change, both in Sri Lanka and the global south? So, you would like to respond?
So, just to clarify, so the first question by Shafia is about, is there something capable of resisting?
So in the context of this new IMF bailout and...
that's part of what we're also critiquing is this IMF bailout agreement is basically about going back to loans, going back to the same whatever market-based borrowing. I mean, maybe now they're trying to negotiate and unlock different forms of development financing, but ultimately still it is that model. And so I do see it as dispossessive. During the height of the crisis, people were talking about import prioritization, but now it's all about how to phase out these import restrictions, right? So there isn't an alternative, right? There isn't any discussion of the alternative in terms of what would it actually mean to revisit this growth path, right? To try and identify possibilities, areas where Sri Lanka could reduce imports through predominantly agrarian self-sufficiency. So I think, that is the nature of this agreement as it has been formulated. Who knows what will happen? But I do think that the questions that are now being raised about agrarian livelihoods, that is precisely maybe what can also help spark sort of the development of this resistance to this type of dispossession. And again, that depends on the political work. That depends on the organizing work. Who's going to actually take this up? Who's going to actually go speak to people in the villages, in the urban areas, right? And promote an alternative program. And I don't know, I don't have any answers to that, but I think the IMF agreement is broadly in line with those same dispossessive tendencies. So knowing that is the case, what is going to be the character of the resistance, right? And so, that's a big question. To Highland's question, what was it?
It's about, is there something about the current conjuncture that will push for the revival interest in the agrarian question and movements for agrarian change, both in Sri Lanka and the global south?
Yeah, okay, so let's look at this two ways. One way is that, as some of these critical scholars who I mentioned, Van der Ploeg, Harriet Freeman, all, they're talking at a very abstract global level. They're saying the agrarian question is ecologically necessary, right? Because of what we see, right? The disasters, growing disasters with climate change and all that. This is ecologically necessary, this re-engagement, right? But, in terms of, okay, that's one opening, right? Again, domestically, is there another possible political opening? Again, it depends on the formations that coalesce. But I do see space to develop these. I think, okay, let me speak out loud here, just sort of brainstorming. But I think we have talked a lot about research questions, and that's important. We do need to do more research. But I think now we should have the confidence of a political vision also. To not just say, okay, we're going to do more and more research and accumulate more and more knowledge. Yes, that's important. But now let's take this even further, maybe even further than Harriet Freeman would go, maybe even further than Van der Ploeg would go, and say, no, representation is a political demand, right? It is a demand on the state. it is an attack on, wealth. I mean, we hear all the time about the Green New Deal, right? We hear all the time about other programs and policies, especially in Western countries. What is the alternative from the South's perspective? And that is, I think, where we need to have the confidence. And again, I'm keeping this open-ended. That's why I said earlier, a pluralistic approach, right, to national liberation struggles. I don't believe we can derive a model from any one single country, whether it's China, US, whatever, Russia, I don't care. Okay? Even during the 70s, they were having these debates about Soviet Russia, right? Let's talk seriously now, okay, about an actual political vision, and again, link it to the local context, right? Link it to this place. But I do see hope because of the research that's already been done, theorizing that's already been done. There needs to be more research. But in response to Helen's question, also the confidence of that kind of vision. So.
Okay, thank you. So, any other questions? There was one more question from Sumati. It's the question of land and ownership vis-a-vis Malaya community and the agrarian question has not been explored. Any ideas?
About the Malaya?
Yeah, land ownership, the question of land and ownership in relation to Malaya community, plantation community, and the agrarian question. So that's not been explored.
Yeah.
Any idea?
Like why it hasn't been explored, or like what?
No, I think Kumar, sorry, this Sumati here. After I wrote this, Kumar also talked about it. I think it was Kumar, I'm not sure. So I think maybe, yeah, it has already been addressed, I feel. My question was actually something that Kumar extended. I don't know whether he did that consciously, but it's been complemented by what Kumar had.
Sumati, could you please repeat your question?
Yeah, my question was like now about the Malaya community's transformation into a land owning community with land dispersion, land being given to them, and they are becoming land holders on what basis. And for me, the question has to do with what next. This is something that has not been studied, explored, and I think it was Kumar who kind of elaborated on it just a while ago. The idea that this is a community that has land has been its kind of livelihood there and their dwelling place and cultivation, but it is also an export economy. Now, in the transformation, what is going to happen in terms of production as well as their own identity as landholders and peasant farmers or whatever. The idea that somehow you hold land and then you can you are empowered is very dominant in the thinking. And there are some initiatives to make peer the community, the workers who are now to become producers, or give them land to produce tea and become smallholders. Also tea smallholders. But then I don't know where this is all leading to. And this has not been seen in the context of the agrarian question. And this is something that's been very much in the forefront of the future of the Malaya community. Since this year we are commemorating 200 years of their arrival here. So there's so many things happening around, the community's future. And so it's not a marginal question. So, I mean, whether anybody has thought of it in terms of the agrarian question is my question. Sorry, kind of circuitous way of putting it.
Yeah, I mean,
Can I add something to that? Can I add something to that?
I haven't done as much reading, but I know that more recent. Oh.
Can I just add something to what Sumati said about what's happening in Malayalam, just more anecdotally, and because a lot of my students and the young researchers are from Gunawardena. What we are seeing, in addition to this idea of giving them, smallholding tea production, what we are seeing is much more of people appropriating or encroaching into lands of the estates themselves and getting involved in food production, right? In vegetable production and so on. So I think that dimension of how agrarian change comes about, not just, there is a demand for redistribution of land, but also people, when they start to take on their own initiative to encroach into land, into involved in production, that is more a sign of what is to come, that they are themselves making a move. It's not like they're waiting for the state to, hand out land to them. So I just want to mention that phenomenon is also happening. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you both. I think actually I'm going to start just from there. We haven't even talked yet about, peasant resistance or different forms of resistance, right? Whether that's everything from non-payment of fees to squatting, as Ayla mentioned. And I think that, as this crisis sort of evolves, right, and as people are forced into sort of different ways of survival, again, I think it's a reciprocal dialogue to try and draw from that what types of, again, forms, possibilities, alternatives, can be envisioned through precisely what Helen has mentioned, for example, about, squatting. So, and again, Sumati also, it's raising a lot of important analytical distinctions. Is it just about redistributing land for cash crop production, or is it food production? Like, what are we talking about here, right? There are so many levels of this, right, in terms of the political dynamics. So, I think that demands often have to be simple, short, sweet, but there is also a lot of theorizing that happens behind those demands. So again, I think these are really important questions, and even this whole connection between land, property, sovereignty, identity, right? This is huge, right? We really have to think about this. How are we framing this agrarian question in Sri Lanka within the broader Indian Ocean world, right? And is it that we're also envisioning possibilities of alliance, connection, right? For example, in Malaysia, right, with, the agrarian question there, and the fact that, people, initially migrated, right, through other forms of indenture to work in the tin mines, rubber plantations, what have you. So, this is not just a vast field for research, it's also a vast field for engagement. And, I'm excited to learn more and to talk more with people who are forming these initial communities to discuss these questions. But I fully agree, with the points you all are making, and also that Alan is saying, like, it shouldn't just be seen as a top-down kind of change, right? So again, that's part two, but for now we have part one. And yes, I just really want to thank you all for your engagement, your contributions. Love to carry this on in informal discussions, and so thank you all again very much.